Greetings and welcome to the Mowglis Memories podcast, featuring stories, interviews, and memories from Mowglis School of the Open, a camp for boys on Newfound Lake in East Hebron, New Hampshire. I'm your host, Wayne King, and my goal is to bring you interesting stories from Mowglis' more than 100 years of existence on the shores of Newfound Lake. I'll do that by interviewing alumni and friends and family, and perhaps from time to time telling you a few stories of my own and inviting you to share your stories with us as well. In this podcast, I'll be interviewing Frank Punderson. Frank was a Mowglis camper in 1941, 42, 45, 46, and 47, and was 24 years on the board of trustees of Mowglis as well. He's truly a Mowglis icon, and he will share stories with us about Colonel Elwell, Colonel John Hill, Allen Brown, one of Connecticut's most respected and honored attorneys, and of course, the great Wapanaya, W. Richard West Sr., who was at Mowglis for a few years before Frank arrived, but also during the years that he was there. Frank was also attending Mowglis just prior to World War II, and Mowglis was closed for 2 years from 1943 to 1944 while Colonel Elwell was serving the country in World War II, and reopened again in 1945. Frank was fortunate enough to attend Mowglis in the years both preceding and after that period. So here, without any further ado, is my interview with Frank Punderson.
I'm one of the last people around who attended camp before World War II, and really knew the colonel and what was going on prior to World War II. And Jesus, I can't believe it, but too bad you couldn't have gotten hold of John Hill and Allen Brown earlier, because they had a whole look at it long before they were here in the mid-30s. And Allen was the colonel's assistant, and I've got a great story about him you may or may not have heard, but anyway, and John Hill, John started the work weekend, and the three of us used to stay at the what was then the Deep River Motel and do a good job on a bottle of Jack Daniels, and we had a hell of a time back then. And two remarkable men.
Yes. So John Hill, he was at Mowglis in the late 30s.
Early 30s.
Early 30s.
Yeah, Begson can fill you in. His family, he was raised near where the Elwells lived in Boston on Boylston Street, or Commonwealth. Hill family owned the apartment building that the Elwells lived in. And John went to Harvard. I think the colonel did. I didn't know if they knew each other there, but I don't think so. But maybe they did. Anyway, their connection goes, of course, way back. And John Hill spent his career in the military and had an incredible career in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And he only got to be colonel, I'm sure, because did you ever know him?
I did, yes, but I never heard the story of how he came to be Colonel Hill.
Yeah, well, he had a personality. He would never be shy about telling his commanding officer to stuff it, and I'm sure that kept him from flag rank. But he was the real thing. On Guadalcanal, he was in command of an artillery battery on Henderson Field. You know what I'm referring to? You know what Henderson Field was?
Yes.
Okay, and Edson Ridge, which the Marines were defending, which was to keep the Japanese away from Henderson Field and thereby controlling the island. There were 1,500 Marines on Edson Ridge, and there were 6,000 of the very crack Japanese Imperial Marines coming up the hill at them. And Hill had set up this battery of 155 howitzers on Henderson Field, and he was firing defilade over the ridge. And if he hadn't been doing that, the Marines could never have done, which they did, which of course they repelled the Japanese. And one of the most classic tactical battles in history. I mean, they just did an unbelievable job. But it was Hill who really, made the difference because, with automatic weapon fire, they couldn't have even begun. And the Marines were using Springfield rifles, 1903 bolt-action rifles. They hadn't gotten the Garands yet. The Army had them, but the Marines hadn't. And another insight to that story is that when I was at Middlebury, I learned to fly, and I knew by the time I graduated I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And I met a girl spring vacation skiing up at Stowe, and she invited me down to her home on St. James, Long Island, which I went to between my finals and graduation. And God, I'm in this house, and her father comes home one day. He's huge, gruff, boisterous man, and he came in, and we got introduced. He says at some point, "Well, young man, what are you going to do when you graduate from Middlebury?" And I said, "Sir, I'm going to be an Air Force fighter pilot." I didn't know the Marine Corps had any friggin' airplanes. I never even thought about it. And he looked at me and he said, "Fuck, you're going to be an Air Force. You're going to the Marine Corps." Well, it turned out he had flown with Pappy Boyington with the famous Baba Black Sheep, VMF 121, off of Henderson Field, and he was there when John Hill was. And he didn't know John, but I don't know. I never asked him that, actually, but he says, "Come on, we'll make a couple martinis. We're going to my den," which we did, and we're sitting there, and I'm looking around the walls, and here's a picture of him standing next to an F-4U Corsair with 7 Japanese airplanes he'd shot down. He was an ace by the time he was 21 years old, it was an epic tale, what the Marine aviation did in that fracas. Wow. and what he did. And at the time I met him, he was flying for United, the New York Paris flight, and he's retired, although he was still the commanding officer of the Marine Squadron at Floyd Bennett, which is a field that no longer exists on Long Island. And he subsequently died one summer on a deployment down at Beaufort, and climbing out of the cockpit of a Panther jet, and he had a heart attack and died. Thank God he didn't do it en route to Paris somewhere, but but he was a real character. He was really something. That's how I ended up in the Marine Corps. But that's all going back to John Hill, who had an epic career. He talked about Vietnam and Korea, but I never followed the thread too well. I mean, those things, they go on, but he was quite a guy, and obviously a terrific leader in the field, and he and Colonel Elwell were two birds of a feather.
Huh. So you were at Mowgli as a camper from 41
42.
And 42, and then the camp was closed for
until 45.
Until 45, and then you continued on 45, 46, 47. 47 is junior staff, correct?
I think so. I can't really remember. I was junior staff, I'm quite sure. It's funny, I don't have a lot of, because the next year, 48, I went away to Deerfield, so I think it was the year before I went to prep school. But 45, the colonel had gone back. They'd asked him to go back into the Army. They didn't bring him back as a colonel. I think they brought him back as a captain. and he'd been a lieutenant colonel in World War One, and they wanted him to come back to teach them woodsmanship and how to cut trees to block the enemy might come and deploy armored vehicles and whatnot, and he went in there to tell people how to drop trees across the road and how to use natural resources to tangle up lines of communication and whatnot. But he didn't. I don't know where he went, what he did back in the Army, but I knew obviously he came out early because the war was still going on in 1945. And in fact, one of my favorite Mowgli stories, you probably have heard it, but I was, I'd gone from Cubs to Yellow Panther. Panther in those days was divided into yellow and black. Panther, and in those days you went from Cubs to Blue to Tumai to Aquila to Panther. So I jumped in 3 years age-wise to be qualified to go to Panther. And but I was the youngest kid on the Mount Washington squad in 1945 that Gaius Merwin led. Now, he was the grandfather of the Merwins that are at Mowgli today, and the father of Gus Merwin, who was the crew coach later on. And he was a big man. He was like the colonel. He had a big belly, not fat, just a big man, huge legs and so on. And I walked right behind him. It was like walking behind a mountain. And we were coming down off the cone of Washington for our first night. We'd started at Pinkham, and we were coming down off the cone. It was, of course, late afternoon, and we could see the Lakes of the Clouds hut, and there were all these people shouting and screaming, waving their arms. And I said, I'll never forget, I said, Mr. Merwin, what do you suppose is going on down there? And he said, gee, I have no idea. And these people came up to it. Japan had just surrendered. It was August 17th, 1945.
Wow.
Yeah, it was one of those moments you never forget. And he, by the way, was quite a man. He had come back at the colonel's request to become tripmaster, and he had, I think I'd been tripmaster back in the 30s sometime, but he was then, I would guess, in his late 50s, and he was overweight. He wasn't fat, but he really struggled. I just remember him turning around to me and saying, boy, the weasel grease is really running. And he was just, going up the head wall. He was really having trouble, but he was a wonderful man, just like his sons and grandsons. And so he and the colonel were, of course, old buds from way back. I don't know how he connected with Mowgli or the colonel or anything else, but the next year, Carter Gibbs became tripmaster, and his brother George, who had been a Marine enlisted man and fought on Guadalcanal, George ran the George Jr., of course, range, and unfortunately, he was a bit of a loose cannon. I think he was suffering from post-traumatic syndrome, or whatever the hell they call it these days. I mean, he had had a wild combat life in the Marine Corps, and of course Guadalcanal was a desperate action, and I guess they didn't ask him to come back, but Carter had been a B-17 waist gunner in World War II, and he was credited with shooting down one of those balloons. The Japanese sent hundreds of thousands of incendiary balloons. They launched them in Japan, put them up in the jet stream, and they were to come over and then fall on our force and start fires. And I don't know what they really expected, but that was their game plan. And I guess Carter was in this airplane flying on the state of Washington somewhere, and they spot one of these things, and he shot it down from the waist gunner position of the B-17. And but he was a great tripmaster, and became a friend I saw frequently after World War II. In fact, I at a later date almost bought the Carter farm, up the Gibbs farm, up in in Hebron.
In Hebron, yeah.
In East Hebron, they were asking, I think, $45,000 for it. It was just, wasn't in the cards. But I was in love with the idea, but it was not practically something I should or needed and didn't do. But the whole Gibbs family, the father George, was Colonel's right-hand man. I mean, he was really, maybe it was his job description. I have no idea, but the whole physical plan of the camp devolved around George Gibbs, and he also.
So that was Carter's father.
Yes, Carter and George's father. Yeah, and George was a really loved kids. Drove us all when we went on trips with that. You remember I don't know if you ever saw it, that sort of a personnel car. It was had an open back to it with
the big black
curtains that rolled
down.
With a black thing, and about 6 kids on a side or something. I don't know, but he would drive us everywhere, and he was always so kind and so thoughtful, and and I just remember him as such a fine person, and he was, and his wife was also a sweetie pie. She was Catherine, I think, was her name, and they lived over there on that farm, and he had been a hill farmer, and the boys had been, walked to school and so on and so forth. I hadn't thought about telling you about this, but the story about Clyde Smith living up on Mount Cardigan. You know that one, don't you?
Well, whether I know it or not is irrelevant.
Yeah,
It's
I know.
An interesting story to
hear. Well, Mickey was, which is of course his nickname, who was, built like a. He should have been a runner. He had the long legs, and he was sinewy and strong and very lean. He used to walk to school down Cardigan into Grafton and go to some elementary school there and walk back home after school every day, rain or snow. Well, snow. They moved him. His father was moved by the Forest Service down to the Carolinas into a watchtower down there, fire tower down there, where he was. But Mickey and I, after Mowgli, would oftentimes team up together. We did a lot of hiking and kayaking, and he was doing his photography books, and I just remember never quite being able to keep up with him. But I remember running down Cardigan one time. That must have been, I don't know, I'd been in the Marine Corps. I must have been in the 60s sometime, and he was still very agile and strong. And
so you were contemporaries at Mowgli together, though?
No, not as campers. He was slightly younger than I am, and I didn't know him until after the war. I didn't know him as a cub, and I can't remember if he was a camper when I met him. I think he may have been in the junior staff. Don't really remember, Wayne. But he was, of course, a kingpin in the whole trip department, and led many of the trips and whatnot. And,
now, do you recall when the Colonel closed Mowgli for those 2 summers, how you were notified, or anything of the experience of?
I don't. Of course, my parents could have told you that. Of course, being a little boy, I was 7 when 1941 or 8 or something. I don't know how we were notified. Obviously, the word had to have been sent out that the camp would not open, and when they did reopen it, obviously all the old campers' parents were sent letters, I guess, and that's how it opened. But I do want to tell you about the before World War II. the culture in the camp, and with the war, obviously starting in December of 41, that summer of 41, it's still, things were really getting hot, and we did military drills, and we had wooden rifles, and we were going through the manual of arms, and capture the flag was a war game. It was very competitive, and it was a precursor of, well, obviously what was coming, and in 42, of course, the war was going, and we also, during that period, we played cricket down on the Gray Brothers Field, and we played quite a bit of it. It was, of course, Colonel was an Anglophile, as was Mrs. Elwell, and I guess that's how it it got introduced, I suppose. But I remember seeing cricket bats laying around even long after World War II, before they obviously got just discarded and whatnot. But it's a wonderful game, and everyone really got a.
I can recall in my early days at Mowgli in the early '60s, we had an Indian, not American Indian, but an East Indian counselor named Shad Farrakey, who pulled out all that old cricket equipment and taught us to play cricket.
No kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So
that's great.
That would have been probably 64, 63 or 64.
Yeah.
But I think that was the last time that it was used when Mr. Farrakey was around. He taught tennis.
Never knew that era. I always regret it that I never. Well, I was in college, and then I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years, and then I was in coaching, and I was off and getting married and so on. So I didn't really pay much attention until Lockwood Merriman, who was on the original Holt Elwell Foundation board, got hold of me and asked me to replace him. He was getting off the board, and I had not known him from Mowgli, but he had been my Shakespeare professor at Middlebury College. And Woody Merriman, who you see at work weekends now, is his son. And Lockwood, this is back in the 60s. I went on the board, I think, or in the early 70s, somewhere in there, replacing Lockwood, who was in failing health, and he Lockwood he had been at Mowgli in the 30s. He'd been a contemporary of my brother's. They were close friends, and I remember going into class at Middlebury College of this course he gave in Shakespeare, and he looked at me and said, "Punderson, you got a brother, Jim?" and that's how that all got going.
Now, how do you know how you and Jim came to be at Mowgli?
Yeah, my aunt, Molly Punderson, was talk about an Anglophile. She never married until she was in her mid-60s. When she married Norman Rockwell, she was his third wife. My family all came from Stockbridge, Mass. And Molly graduated from Williams High School in 1910, I think. My father and she were close to one another. They both graduated. She went on. Imagine this now. This is in the early 1900s, and she's a woman. Stands about 4 feet 9 or 10. Little girl. Goes to Radcliffe and graduates summa cum laude.
Wow.
And then became head of the English department at Milton Academy for 55 years as a single woman, and goes back to Stockbridge at the end of her career, and starts teaching these little Tea Party seminars on literature at her home in Stockbridge, and Norman, whose second wife had died, used to come to these things, and they literally fell in love. And they were married in 1961, just after Linda and I were, and had a wonderful life together till they both died of old age. But Molly knew Colonel Elwell because she, of course, lived outside of Boston in Milton, and I don't know how she got to know him. I think Elizabeth Ford Holt was in that somewhere, but I can't remember. And Molly heard about Mowgli, and my brother started there in 37, I think, 30. And I remember seeing pictures of him. He was a big horseback rider at Mowglis, something that has long gone by the board, and was living at Tumai when the Gray brothers burned. And he said it always amazed me they didn't evacuate us they didn't think it was going to be that bad, I guess. But of course the whole thing went down eventually, and the heat was enormous, and it didn't burn Tumai, but of course they got them all out of there. And two boys died, as you know, and all I know about it is through his tales about it. And he tells me, Bob Bankston could probably corroborate this or not corroborate it, but he said the kid that was, there were more than two of them sleeping in Gray Brothers that night, and one of them smelled the smoke and sort of sensed what was going on, and he didn't wake the other two boys, and before he got back into control, the boys were at risk and not able to be retrieved or waken up, whatever the hell it was. How did I get on this?
Well, I asked you about how you and your brother came to Mowgli.
Oh, okay, yeah, and I used to, of course, we used to come up. My mother and father, we stayed at Toby's Cabins, which is now a condo development, as you know, down the road below the Hillside Inn, and we used to go up and go to crew races and the whole bit, and it was just a matter of time till I was old enough that I went myself in 1941. And I tell you, this I think is a good story about the Colonel and his relationship with campers. When, of course, I spent that first summer in Fort Hall, had an absolutely great summer, and end of the summer, Mother and Dad come up. I remember they had a Blue DeSoto, and they came up to pick me up, and I'd packed my trunk, and it was in the back of the car, and we were parked in front of the wood shop, and just getting ready to launch to head home. And the Colonel walked by, and Mother and Dad and the Colonel all had the usual goodbyes and so on and so forth, and we're all standing there chit-chatting, and my mother looked at me and said, "Well, Frank, how was your summer?" And I said, "I don't want to go home." And they all sort of snickered and laughed and whatnot. And Mother said, "Well, how are you going to stay warm? It gets cold up here in the wintertime." The Colonel wore, most of the time, he had a big cardigan, wool knitted gray sweater with the M down on the pocket, and a buttoned up, 3 or 4 buttons. And of course he was, to me, big as a house as a human being. And so I said to everyone assembled, "Well, I'm just going to get inside Colonel's sweater, and that's where I'm going to spend the winter." And of course, everyone died of hysterics over that. And the irony to that is, when I became a trustee I guess it must have been in the 70s, I was poking around the jungle house, and I found that sweater hanging on a hanger, and it was pretty moth-eaten and so on and so forth. I don't know whatever became of it, but it was too bad it wasn't. I didn't have the presence of mind to put it somewhere and make it a record of some sort. to preserve it, but it was his hallmark. And he never wore a hat or anything, but he wore that sweater a lot, and that's how I was going to survive a winter.
So you were there as a kid at the same time that Richard West was a staff member, or
Richard who?
Richard West, Wapanaya.
Oh yes. Well, that was before the war. Wapanaya, went in the Navy and became a commander. I think on a destroyer. It must have been a hell of an officer. Oh, but yes, he was there at least in 41. I don't know if he came back in 42. Probably not. The war was going on. I imagine he'd been inducted by then or joined up or whatever he did. But, Wayne, he was the archetypal, what you think of as an American Indian. I mean, he had a gut that was ripped, a beautiful physique, and no hair. I remember him talking one time about how when he was raised, he would take a shell and scrape his face so hair wouldn't grow on it, or when it did grow, they'd scrape it off like a razor. And so, and he had that, you've seen pictures of him. I mean, he had that Asian black hair and broad nose and wide cheekbones and very athletic and quiet, but he had an elegance about him. You respected him, and he had just a nice presence, and he was very affable, and we ate with him and so on and so forth. But he gave several campfires in full regalia, the feathers going from the bonnet, huge bonnet of feathers, and going all the way down his back to his feet, and wore the moccasins, carried a tom-tom at the fire, and would tell us stories, and then sing these ritual songs of his of the Cheyenne tribe, and tell the war stories and what it was like in his life there. Of course, he never lived on the plains, but his father fought the white man. And think of that connection.
Right.
I mean, here I am talking to you that I actually knew the son of a man who fought the white man.
Quite possibly Little Bighorn.
Quite possibly what?
At Little Bighorn.
Oh, I have no. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's
right.
I thought, were the Cheyennes involved in that?
Yes, the Cheyenne were involved in tricking Custer into going into the valley.
That's right.
And
yeah.
the Sioux were up top.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I do know that. And the Cheyenne were great horse people, and Wapanaya, I don't know where he got the horse, but I saw him ride it somewhere around the campus and around the camp. But that story I've told you about him running through the woods when we were playing Capture the Flag, the Den Bridge was the dividing line. And, the whites had the waterfront and the blues or the blacks or whoever or red had the other, the campsite, and the flag was somewhere around the bridge, and it was it was really very intense. It was not just oh gosh, let's go today and play. It was structured. It was run by the staff, and there were rules and so on and so forth. And I was up there where the organ is by the chapel sitting. I was an outpost because I was only a cub, and I'm just sitting there picking my nose probably, and Jesus, this thing went right by me, and I never saw it coming, and I saw Wapanaya running at full speed, and I hadn't even heard it approach, and he was the real McCoy, and of course I've told you the story of a parents' weekend where he put a a five of spades on a bale of hay, maybe 50 feet from where the archery thing was there below den. And he holed out, pulling arrows out of his quivers as fast as he could fire them. And it was not a bow made by Sears Black. It was his own bow. I mean, I had just a fleeting glimpse of a culture and a way of life that, has long gone by the board. I mean, it's just amazing.
So what happened with the five of spades? He obviously, tell that story.
Well, he had it up on there was a bullseye target, hanging on the bales of hay that were the backstop for the archery range, and where you shot your arrows sort of down the hill onto what is now the field that Bob Bankston created years later. He pinned an ace of spades, the five of spades to the target, and from a distance of 50 feet. I don't really remember. It wasn't very far, but it was, the point was that he holed them out. I mean, he took 5 arrows out of his quiver just as fast as he could place them on the bow, pull, and and release. And I'm not sure he holed every one of them, but pretty damn close. I can't remember, but I mean, everyone was going, "Oh my God," I mean, here was obviously an inbred skill that he possessed, and it was part of his culture. And I took archery lessons from him, I remember, and it's not a lot to it, especially when you're about 8 years old. But he was just a wonderful guy, and I never saw him when he came back to redo the Gray Brothers screen. I wanted to come over. I knew he was there. I think my brother went over and went up to see him, and but he was pretty much a pretty well used up old man by then. I think, from what I've heard. I didn't see him, but he had quite a career, doing the murals in the post office down in Washington, D.C., which I've gone to see. When I went down, his son Richard started maybe you knew him. He started the American Indian Museum down on the near the Smithsonian on the Mall, which I've been to. And I tried to meet up with him and missed him one day. He'd gone out for a meeting or something, and I'd never met him. And every winter, I used to get my mother to send Richard West a gallon of maple syrup from Massachusetts, because I knew that, he would like it. And I wished I'd saved his letters where he wrote back to thank us and so on. Gee whiz, too bad, but anyway. Stephen Punderson's got his watercolor paintings, which my brother bought 2 or 3 of them, and I think my brother gave one to the library and then kept 2, and Stephen has either 1 or 2 of them. But, to think that he painted those things, I'm told, with berries that he went out in the woods and crushed and took the dyes to paint those things with, and the accuracy with which they're painted is astonishing.
Yes.
I mean, talk about skills learned, and transferred, and still, apparent at that far down the road. It's really extraordinary, really extraordinary.
Yeah, I knew, or I still know, Rick, his son, who was the first, who founded the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. In fact, Alice and I were invited to go down for the opening powwow.
Oh no! Wonderful.
Yeah, and it was amazing.
Yeah. I'll bet it was.
And Jim, his other son, was my counselor at Mowgli. Rick was there before me in the late 50s. Mm-hmm. But Jim was my counselor, and he and I are still in touch. He's recently retired from an organization called Futures for Children, which works with Native American kids, getting them into colleges.
Yeah. Well, who was their mother? I mean, obviously Richard West Wapanaya's wife.
Right.
Did you ever meet her? Or?
I never met her, and I wasn't there the summer that he returned. Although I've heard a story that some camper remarked about him being an old man within his earshot, and he then proceeded to do a one-armed pull-up in the doorway at Gray Brothers.
Oh, cut it out! Wow!
and say someday you're gonna tell this story about that old Indian guy.
yeah, that's great. Is that true?
Well, that's the story I've heard, and I intend to get it verified at some point.
yeah. You know, a great story that I don't know if there's anyone else still around that remembers it, but in 45, you know, it was rainy day. And during those days, they put a fire in Gray Brothers, and we all go in and do something, watch movies or whatever. And there was a boy in blue who was a Russian, who's, I don't know how he connected with Mowgli. I haven't a clue, but he was a nice-looking, very quiet, robust, strong young boy of blue age. And on this particular day, they had, for one of the diversions for a rainy day, the counselors used to have, there was a big wheel that must have been in a frame. Probably the diameter of the wheel was maybe 4 or 5 feet or something, and it rotated inside of a wooden frame with openings in the frame. And they would take a piece of metal, like light sheet metal, maybe it's part of a roof or something, and they'd lay it over the humpback of this wheel. And when you turn the crank, it created a noise that was supposed to sound like an aircraft engine. And it made a hell of a racket, particularly inside of Gray Brothers. And then they had a wooden bench that had a staff member holding on either end of it, and you were told that you were going to go fly in an airplane, and they had a little rucksack with a pillow in it or something to replicate a parachute, and they had some goggles and sort of like a flying helmet. And you put all this gear on, and you were marched up. You were in line, and you walked up, and you'd step up on this bench, and they'd start cranking this machine, making this racket, and the bench would, these guys holding on either end would, pick it up and put it down and roll it around and so on and so forth to give you the sensation. It was pretty cute. So each kid is asked, as he comes up, have you ever flown in an airplane before? Well, of course, practically nobody had. And this Russian kid comes up, and they say, well, whatever. His name ended in SKY, something ski. Maybe he was Polish. I don't know. Maybe he was Polish or Russian. Wait a minute. So they say to this little kid, you ever been in an airplane before? And he very quietly says, yes, sir. And, then they said, have you ever parachuted before? Yes, sir. And of course, things get very quiet. And I'm not sure the story came out right there, but it subsequently came out soon thereafter that his parents, who were under pressure from the Nazis coming into Poland or Russia, got him into an airplane at nighttime to get him out of the country and get him out of the Nazi onslaught. And this airplane, I guess there must have been obviously some other people on it, had engine trouble, and all the passengers bailed out, and this kid was one of them. Into the night.
Wow.
Yeah. And you'd have thought, well, I had I had something for dinner last night. I mean, he told the story. I think he told the story, or somebody told the story subsequently. I don't remember that scene, but I mean, at this situation. And, you know, I've never heard anyone else talk about it. And of course, there's not many people around left and none that I ever see. Tony Barnard and Peter Noki are the only two, I think, who are still alive in my den. Barnard lives in Los Angeles, and Noki he's a retired professor from the University of Alaska and lives in Fairbanks. I keep trying to get him to come to work weekend. I'm going to do it this year. I'll pay his goddamn ticket if I have to. And and they must have been there and heard the story, but I've never been able to corroborate. But it was it was a showstopper.
Wow,
Mm-hmm.
that is, and it would be nice to know who he was.
Yeah. I know.
Well,
you'd have to.
You said it was 45 or 46?
It was in 45. It was right 45. After the war was still going on. I know. Yeah. I'm quite sure.
Well, there must be a roster of kids from that year. Maybe we could get Bob to look it up.
Yeah. That'd be good. Yeah.
Now you were a trustee for 24 or more years.
Years.
That's got to be a record.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah, I suppose it must be. I went on the board because of Lockwood Merriman's departure, and Livingston was the chairman then, and things were, Bill Hart had come aboard and was running the show. I was so surprised one day. My youngest son, Sam, called me up and he said, Dad, I'm thinking about becoming the director of Mowgli. I said, really? I didn't know any of that, which he did. And he immediately instituted modernization of the administration and the whole mechanics of Mowgli's operation, and it was just wonderful at what he did. But he and his wife Kate, who is she's the headmaster of Carabasset Valley Ski Academy at Sugarloaf, Maine, and still is. And they adopted this boy from Russia. And Sam said, Dad, I can't. I've got to leave this. I've got to go back to. I've got to be full-time father back in Carabasset Valley. So that's when the search went out. And I said, well, you be damn sure you hire an alumnus. Well, we've got a great guy. We got a guy named Nick Robbins. And I said, yeah, what den was he? And he said, Dad, he didn't go to Mowgli, but he's a professional camper. And this guy is sharp. And I've known him, and I know other camp directors who know him within the director or the camp associations and whatnot. And everyone thinks he walks on water. And we're hiring him. I said, oh, well, okay. I mean, I had no force in effect anyway. I mean, it was just a courtesy call. And, of course, now we know that Nick Robinson was Nick Robbins. I mean, and I think it's wonderful that Bob has come over and run the wood shop and done all the things he does, plays the piano and the whole bit. I mean, he's done a lovely job of doing it. But, man, I'll tell you, there was a time there when that camp was almost gone. And so it all worked out for the best.
Well, you played a hugely significant role in saving it.
Well,
and I think years hence, people will remember that.
I don't know. Doesn't make any difference. But I tell you what I didn't do, and I've always regretted it, is that Henry and I were going to institute a trust and set up a organization that would be financially, we were going to raise a lot of money and do all this stuff. Well, I was just closing down my life in real estate, and I just couldn't do it. I just didn't have the time to do the things that I really should have done. And then when Sanath and the board came through the pipeline, they took control, and they did it, and they did what they've done, which is just unbelievable. I mean, Chris Vaneth is the guy you really gotta give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was the guy that really turned it around, and he really deserves it. And I've told him that many times. And so there it goes. Here we are.
Yeah, right. And with a pretty much full house.
Oh boy, full. It's over full.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just great. No, I mean the whole thing is a wonderful. It could have easily not have happened.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Easily not have happened. I mean, there was a time there when it was very, very dicey.
Now, you told the story about your Mount Washington squad with Gaius Merwin. Well, I assume it was his grandson, Gaius, who was the trip master on my Mount Washington squad in 1969. The two staff were Charlie Walbridge and Gaius Merwin, and this would have been.
I think that may have been his son.
May have been his son. Yep.
I think his son.
But there were three generations of Gaius at Mowgli, correct?
Yes, exactly. And one's there on the staff now, or was last summer.
Right, but that would be,
That's the grandson.
Would be grandson Jason.
That's right. That's correct.
Yes. Yeah. And so you and I both had one of the Merwins.
Yes.
And there were also numerous generations of the Brown family, including Alan. Who Alan was, I believe, a trip master at Mowgli as well, wasn't he?
He was indeed. Yeah. Let me tell you a great Alan Brown story that Bob heard, and Bob may be able to tell it better than I can. But one night there was a counselor's supper as usual up at the Jungle House after taps, and Alan was at that point, I think, assistant director. Or maybe he was still a counselor, I'm not sure. Anyway, he went up to have his cereal or whatever he had, and during his time up there, a food fight developed. Have you heard this story?
I have, but I think it's a great story. I hope you'll continue it.
Yeah, and a food fight developed, and he was sort of nonplussed by it all. He just got up and walked out, and went back to where he was sleeping, and the colonel came down and woke him up at, I don't know, midnight or sometime during the night, and said, "I want to see you up on my porch." Well, that's like being asked to go up in front of the execution wall. And so Alan said, I went up there, and the colonel looked at me and he said, "Alan, I hear you were up at the Jungle House tonight when all that fracas happened." And Alan said, "Yes, I was. And I did not approve of it, and I walked out of there." And the colonel said, "Alan, what you should have done, if you were truly a leader, would be to break it up and put it all back together again. But you didn't. You turned your back and walked away from it." And as Alan said, telling this story to me and whoever else at the time, said, that's one of my great life lessons. Of course, he became to be the most highly acknowledged attorney in the state of Connecticut.
Right.
And I used to go down to his farm a lot, and just go down. I just get up from Vermont, go down, and I'd take him out to dinner, and this is long before he got sick, and spend the night there and go someplace else. But I just adored that man. I mean, he was and talk about a worker. And of course, the story on Mount Washington, the summit of Washington, when they loaded his pack with pig iron. My brother was part of that.
Well, tell that story. Tell that story.
Well, I, of course, saw third hand, but they were at the summit of Washington, and Alan had a pack board, and they were carrying supplies down to the Lakes of the Clouds on this particular trip. And how that fit into the Mount Washington squad, no idea. But anyway, my brother went over to the Cog Railway, and they found these pieces of scrap iron, and they took an old mattress. I guess there was a mattress already had been placed on the pack board or was about to be, and they took the pig iron and wrapped it up in the folds of the mattress and rigged the pack board. But it was way more than most people could have even picked up, and Alan actually got it up on his back, not knowing what was really the story or anything, and apparently walked about 50, 60 yards before he just had to throw the pack off and put it on the ground, and of course everyone had a big laugh about it. But he was he worked at the Appalachian Mountain Club after Mowgli. He became a trip master. Not a trip master, but
a hut boy.
A hut master.
Yeah.
Or a hut boy or something, that was how he got there, and the Washington squad met up with him up there, and
so he didn't carry it all the way down to Lakes. The boys revealed their stunt to him shortly after. I said he didn't carry.
He didn't get it very far, no, of course.
Right.
I mean, the thing must have weighed several hundred pounds, and
right.
on a backboard, and I mean, just the mechanics of all that weight above your head must have been daunting. But Alan was a very strong boy, as his sons are, and but his tales, getting him and John Hill together was just a hoot. And of their telling the stories with the Colonel and the things, way back in the 30s. And it's just too bad you weren't able to do this earlier when these guys were still alive. Right. And, Bob and I went out, I asked Bob to join me. I met him on Cape Cod, and we took the ferry out to the vineyard where John Hill was living. And we did a tape recording of his reminiscences. Bob has that. And we also did it with, I met Bob down at Alan Brown's farm after Alan was really getting sick. And we did another recording down there, and we did one with my brother. And I don't know what's become of them, but you might look into that.
I also, on video, did your brother and Alan Brown at Alan's house. I guess it would have been in 2002 or 2003.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't realize you were there. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's what I'm talking about.
Well, I don't know whatever happened to those tapes, but hopefully they're still around and they'll get somehow cataloged with all of the other things that are being archived.
Well, for the last probably 10 years, I have been on Bob's case about doing a Mowgli history. And Bob's got all that in his head. I mean, he knew the Russell sisters. Of course, he knew Myron Braley and George Gibbs. He didn't know the Colonel. But, I mean, his knowledge of the Russell sisters gave him all kinds of historical information going back to Elizabeth Ward Holt. And Bob's got all that in his head. I mean, there's nobody else who knows what he knows. He could do an outline.
Yeah. Now, I have one legend that I wanted to ask you about before we end, and that is that when I was growing up, there was always a legend around camp that the Colonel had stashed a cache of old weapons that he didn't want around the camp, that he had buried them somewhere on the grounds. Did you ever hear this story?
Now that you mention it, I may have, but as far as I know, there's no substance to it.
Okay.
But first of all, he wasn't a weapons guy.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't his focus.
Right.
I'd be surprised if he, who knows, but I'd be surprised if he would, he lived in Boston most of the year, and he could have kept him up in Mowgli, of course, and he may have done. But I remember someone saying something about that once, but it was never followed up, and it was never had, in my opinion, never had any credibility. But who knows?
Right.
If it's true, they're long gone.
Right. I always thought of it as just sort of some story that had been made up along with the green-eyed Kamada and
yeah, right, exactly. As you're sitting here talking, I remember being a trustee back probably in the 80s or 90s or something. I was up at a meeting, and the water ran out at camp, and there was a spring with a spring house over it across the highway from the jungle house up on the side of the hill, and it had a foot valve in the bottom. It was a concrete cistern with a house over it, and to keep people from falling in it and whatnot. Anyway, that foot valve had rusted out, I guess, and this is the I think it was in the spring sometime. In any event, it had to be fixed. I'll never forget taking off all my clothes and lowering myself into that frigging cistern. I mean, it was cold, and going down, holding my breath, and fixing the problem. I don't know what I fixed it with, but I remember coming up and saying, "Jesus, this trusteeship isn't quite what it's it was set up to be." And but there were Robbins is God's gift to ourselves and to the camp. He's just wonderful, and the only thing in my cognizance having to do with Mowgli that is missing and needs to be done is that history, and it has to be done. It'd be a pity not to do it. Mowgli is something no other camp can ascribe to. The School of the Woods, that's what it is, and someone's got to tell a story. I don't say this because you're trying to recruit with it. It's just that it's a chapter in American camping that needs to be in.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Thanks to Frank Punderson for his insights and for his great stories about life at Camp Mowgli as a boy in 1941, 42, 45, 46, and 47, and for his many years of service to Mowgli as a member of the Board of Trustees and a loyal member of the Mowgli family. If you have stories that you would like to share with the rest of the Mowgli family, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at Wayne D as in Douglas King 9278 @gmail.com, or give me a call at 603-530-4460. Good hunting, and we'll see you again on the next Mowgli Memories.